Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Developing Your Modern Mainframe Strategy. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that today's webinar is being recorded and you are currently in a listen-only mode. The recording will be made available within the next few days following today's live session. Now I'd like to acquaint you with some of the ways that you can participate during today's presentation. The room you are in today allows you to join via computer audio or telephone audio by clicking the arrow in the top corner of the control panel. We encourage you to submit your questions at any time throughout the session by using the Q&A panel located in the bottom portion of your screen. Simply type your question into the window and be sure to hit send to have your question placed in the queue. We'll address as many questions as time allows. If you experience any technical difficulty during today's event, first try refreshing your browser to reset your connection. If that doesn't work, enter a question into the Q&A pane stating your technical issue, and we'll be more than happy to help you resolve any difficulties you may be experiencing. Now, without further delay, let's begin today's event, Developing Your Modern Mainframe Strategy. I would like to introduce you to your moderator for today, Eric Odell with BMC. Eric, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Developing Your Modern Mainframe Strategy. Organizations highly value mainframe speed, reliability, and security, and this highlights the need for increased developer support for the mainframe. And though it is strategic, a new Forrester Consulting study commissioned by BMC finds that modernization efforts for mainframe application development are still in early stages, and modernization has been slowed by the lack of resources, risk aversion, and isolated development groups. In this webinar, Forrester analyst Brent Ellis will share the results of a new survey that points to the need of building a new culture and a mainframe-inclusive DevOps toolchain for DevOps success. Now, Brent is going to be joined by BMC Mainframe DevOps Evangelists Tony Anter and Mark Schettenhelm for a panel discussion. And after this presentation that explores how you can build toward greater mainframe DevOps maturity and address potholes in your journey in bite-sized chunks. Now, before we get this, I wanted to share with you some highlights of our previous research that led to the study. If you could turn to the second slide. In our previous research, BMC commissioned Forrester and Dimensional Research to conduct mainframe DevOps surveys to learn about the experience organizations are having with their mainframe application development initiatives. And what we discovered was that 8 out of 10 mainframe developers stated that they need significant improvement with mainframe development tools if they're going to be productive and effective. Nearly 3/4 of the organizations surveyed admitted that their mainframe developers' experience needs improvement. And related to the issue of modern tooling was that 2/3 of those surveys said employee satisfaction of the developers is critical to their ability to retain top talent so they can remain competitive. Now, 77% of organizations found it extremely challenging to find developers with the skills needed to modernize critical mainframe applications. And 61% of organizations say that they lack the right mainframe development tools. Only 39% of companies report using modern DevOps tools for key phases of the mainframe software development lifecycle. Now, interestingly enough, 77% of organizations agree that by using modern tools, they could increase velocity by 18%. And 2/3 of those surveys said that by using modern development tools, it would increase quality by 23%. Now, as a result of this research, we wanted to discover if leveraging a modern mainframe application development tools could actually enhance the developer experience to improve business outcomes and drive a significant return on investment. So earlier this year, we commissioned Forrester Consulting to explore key topics and the state of mainframe infrastructure modernization, especially on software development and the role of DevOps. We surveyed 423 IT director level and above decision makers or influencers who work at companies across 20 industries in North America and Europe, and our research found that mainframe decision makers are learning from other areas of the organization, and they are prioritizing organizational changes to their processes along with technological ones to modernize their mainframe organizations. So let's meet our featured guests. And to share the results of this new study, we'll be joined by our featured guest speaker, Forrester, Brent Ellis. Now, Brent serves the infrastructure and operations leaders as an analyst with a senior analyst with Forrester, and he provides holistic thinking about enterprise problems. Brent aims to help clients find the right mix of technologies, processes, and people to maximize their goals and provide the unique value that they have to the world. He's particularly focused on reliable and resilient IT services, storage, cloud infrastructure adoption, and the future of work pertaining to IT professionals and the evolving nature of the I&O. Our panelists for today's event include Tony Anter, who is a DevOps architect and evangelist with BMC Software. Tony has had previous roles as the Director of Engineering at American Express, and he will also be sharing from his experience of rolling out a mainframe DevOps strategy. He is a conference speaker and a blogger on the best practices in Agile and DevOps. Mark Schettenhelm is a DevOps evangelist and product manager for BMC, who has experience working with developers around the world in source control management, testing, DevOps, and application portfolio analysis. He is a frequent conference speaker, blogger, and columnist, often explaining the benefits of bringing Agile and DevOps to mainframe development. His writing has appeared in Enterprise Executive and Enterprise Tech Journal, and is also a dzone.com and ShareTech Watch contributor. My name is Eric Odell. I'm the Solutions Marketing Director at BMC Software for Mainframe DevOps and Data Management. I'm going to be your moderator throughout this webinar, and we will be picking up with the panelists after Brent Ellis shares the findings of his research. So Brent, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric. And I'll turn on my camera, so if anyone wants to see how much my beard has grayed over the past few years, you can. And I'm really here to kind of talk about the information from this study that we did with BMC about how to build better and faster on IBM-Z. Now, the beginning of the story is last spring, BMC reached out to Forrester, and they're really looking to understand how DevOps gets adopted in mainframe environments. And I was really excited to look into this because I'd written a couple of papers last year about the paths towards mainframe modernization. And I had a hypothesis around how DevOps gets adopted, and I wanted to be able to test it. So I worked with our Forrester Consulting team to put together the survey to do that. Now, what I expected to find was something like this. And this DevOps adoption pattern is from one of our Jumpstart DevOps reports at Forrester. And it's a pretty standard way that you adopt DevOps within your environment. But as the big red letters at the bottom of the screen say, I was wrong. Now, to talk a little bit about the survey itself, Eric already mentioned the demographics a little bit, but to break it down a little bit further, you know, these were people that had decision-making capability with regards to mainframe strategy, and they had a mix of roles within IT operations, DevOps, cybersecurity, and help desk. About half of the respondents were at the director level, 15% at the C level, and 35% at the vice president level. So these were people that were making real decisions about mainframe environments for the future of their organization. Now, one of the key things is they wanted to maintain workloads on the mainframe because they saw it as the most secure, the fastest, and most reliable platform for the workloads that they were hosting. So they weren't looking at moving those workloads off of mainframe. But what they did want to do is be able to adopt DevOps and get some of the velocity and benefits that they were seeing on the distributed side. And a lot of these drivers were really around this overall digital transformation strategy, but also some cost management and optimization. With regards to the digital transformation, they really needed the data and the applications that were running on the mainframe to be developed and accessed at the same speed as things at the distributed side, because a lot of the processes within the organizations were becoming more digitized, and you couldn't rely on batch processing in order to serve data fast enough to customers anymore. The other side of the coin, though, is not just the benefits, but the risks of failing to modernize. And this was really important, and these are the top 5 risks that our respondents identified. They They wanted to avoid less reliable application releases, that lack of ability to innovate. They didn't want to be stuck in an old way of doing business just because of their technology. They wanted more predictable development cycles to be able to use things like the sprint methodology to have some sort of predictable idea of when things are happening. They were starting to find that they were unable to serve other parts of the organization. And this really has to do with a lot of the siloing that happens within mainframe applications and application development. And then decreased visibility into live site metrics. On the distributed side, you see a whole lot of live site metrics going on. You can see what's happening with your workloads in real time. And they wanted to be able to kind of take advantage of that on the mainframe, but they also needed to in order to adjust for changes in client access over time and more kind of live use of applications and data by their end users. Now, this question was really posed to people that had actually adopted DevOps on mainframe, and we asked them to list what sort of benefits they were seeing. So they could, check the box on multiple different things. And the biggest one is 65% of respondents said they had an improved developer experience. And that in itself is a huge problem, and it actually correlates with the reduced staffing issues that was number 10 on this list. Because if you have a better developer experience, being able to retain staff and being able to convert staff that are in a mainstream DevOps environment into mainframe becomes a lot easier. But also they had increased workload flexibility, better platform and cost control, reduced costs overall, increased development velocity, increased developer productivity on the mainframe, security, revenue increases. Overall, these are the types of benefits that these businesses were looking for, and this is an early adoption of mainframe DevOps in their environment. To drill down just a little bit, for the respondents that cited cost reduction or development velocity, we asked them to quantify that number for us so that you'd get an idea of what sort of benefit you would get in using DevOps in your environment. And so the people that said they had cost reductions responded that they saw an 18% decrease in costs. So 20% reduction in the cost of application development and maintenance just by implementing DevOps practices. And then of the group that said they saw increased development velocity, 28%. That's almost a third of an increase in development velocity. So, when you couple these together, this is like, saving you money on hiring new developers. This is getting things to market faster. This is having more free available cash to dedicate towards new innovation and really kind of developing that virtuous cycle that you see in good DevOps environments. Now, with regards to the different practices that are being adopted, we asked about a lot of different DevOps specific and kind of adjacent practices within their environment. Everything from allowing developers to develop in an infrastructure agnostic way, to the adoption of SRE, agile methodology, DevOps, CI/CD pipelines. And what we saw is, there was adoption for all of those different things. By far, the biggest one was allowing developers to kind of decouple the way they make applications from the infrastructure that they make it for. But we didn't see a lot of people doing all of these at once. In fact, we saw less than 1% had adopted all of these processes. And when you look in the distributed environment, especially very high change organizations, they're doing all of it. So what I take from this is that we're still in the early stages. And a statistic to think about is 96% of the respondents said they expect to see greater benefits from their organization's modernization initiatives in the future. So if you think back to the benefits that we saw on the pages earlier, all but 4% of the respondents expect to see even greater benefits going forward as they expand their DevOps adoption. Now, when I talk a little bit about how the adoption pattern was different than what I expected, the traditional DevOps adoption is very much we're gonna like experiment and try and build and expand sort of model. But what we saw in the survey respondents is that their investment patterns started at the infrastructure level. They had to get their underlying systems up to the point where they could implement things like Zoe or OpenAPI or different types of tooling in order to even take advantage of DevOps methodologies. And then to Eric's point about borrowing knowledge from other parts of the organization, we saw an investment in organizational structure. Just kind of thinking about like, how do we structure our teams? How do we change our financing for application development to a sprint-based model versus a waterfall model? And really kind of addressing some of the things that slowed down DevOps adoption in the distributed environment and addressing that up front. And after that point, we saw increased investment in tooling and then the refine and iterate. Drilling down a little bit more on the siloing issue and kind of addressing organizational structure, we asked some questions to our respondents about like, where are communications really strained? And you see that there's a lot of different points of strained communication across the entire mainframe infrastructure. Mainframe generally ends up being siloed with an organization outside of like mainstream DevOps already. But even within the mainframe environment, there are silos of professionals like, mainframe developers versus database administrators, or senior most developers versus, line level development operators, junior and senior mainframe developers. And so you have like kind of this consistent noise in the background of strained communication where people aren't communicating well. And those issues must be addressed early on in DevOps adoption in order to get really good results. And when we went back and looked at the data, we started to see kind of, it's not quite at the level of best practice because this is a small sample compared to the rest of the world, but it was a coalescing practice of who was getting the greatest benefits from DevOps adoption. And those were organizations that were updating org structure and making development easier as part of their mainframe modernization initiatives. Often they would say that their top driver behind modernization was addressing complaints and unhappiness from developers, really looking at the developer experience. They had a mainframe development group that was well integrated with other development groups, so really breaking down those silos and doing a lot of knowledge sharing between them. Collaborative relationships between mainframe teams and development teams. Adopting AI ops for mainframes so that they get live site knowledge and an automated response framework for dealing with events in real time. Respondents said that automation was a key step in their mainframe modernization process. So automating both the CI/CD pipeline, but also other aspects of operating their mainframe environment. And then organizational changes came up as more important, or at least as important as technical ones with regards to success in mainframe modernization. So that kind of led me to update the pattern that I saw in the beginning to the one that I have here. I have this catalyze change and communicate the vision on the side, and they happen all along this life cycle. You need to be able to communicate why you're updating your mainframe environment, why you're staying on the platform, why you're doing the changes you're doing, and really communicate the vision of where you're going to be as you get greater and greater adoption. I don't want to say when the process is done, because one of the things about DevOps is that it's definitely a cycle where you refine and improve over time. But then with regards to the steps that you're going through, it's this investment in the foundational infrastructure required, including the organizational changes to your business. Building a tool chain to improve developer experience, often starting with a modern IDE. Beginning with a minimal viable vision, pilot, proof of concept. This is where you kind of like feed back into a mainstream DevOps pattern of kind of building the skills and the successes of moving some of that code into a DevOps pipeline. looking for additional opportunities to expand and scale your efforts, implementing governance that promotes success does not clamp down based on compliance and regulation. You want to be able to govern positively, not negatively here, but you still need security and you still need governance. And then getting to that refine and improve step of practicing continual improvement throughout the organization. So that was kind of what I saw when I actually got to look at the data and hear what practitioners were actually saying. Thank you. And I think I'm going to be passing it right back to Eric, and he's going to kick us off for the panel.
Great. Hey, Brent, these were fantastic insights that you've drawn from this study. And very shortly, we're going to be moving into our panel discussion where you can ask your own questions to Brent as well as our other panelists from BMC CompuWare. But before we start, we wanted to bring to your attention the fact that all of the insightful data that was shared in today's webinar is also available to you in a full report by Forrester Consulting called Developing Your Mainframe, Your Modern Mainframe Strategy, Building a New Culture and Toolchain Together for DevOps Success. Now, we're going to send this study to everyone who registers for the webinar, but let's get started with our panel discussion. And I wanted to start off with you, Brent. What are some of the unexpected things that you learned from the findings of this survey?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one is the one that I just talked about, like the idea that organizations are putting money and change into the organization first. And I was really expecting it to look more like the early DevOps patterns, where you have some fanatical developers that really kind of want to do things differently. But the fact of the matter is that mainframe occupies a different space in the environment, and the barrier to entry is higher. So there needs to be some commitment on the side of the business to changing the org structure and investing in the infrastructure in order to support the developers.
Now, I wanted to welcome Tony Anter and Mark Schettenhelm to the discussion. Thank you for joining us today in this webinar. Now,
Thank you for having us, Eric.
Great. I want to put the same question to you all. Tony, what are maybe some of the unexpected things that you learned from the findings of this survey?
I mean, there were quite a few things that I thought were. There were quite a few things that I thought were surprising, and I think the biggest one was the impact of a culture change or an organizational change on DevOps and on the organization. That's what surprised me the most. I mean, we all saw this when DevOps came out on the distributed side and people started going down this. You had to change your mindset. You had to change the culture and the way people did their work. And it's surprising to me to see that same pattern play itself out on the mainframe side. This isn't just a tooling discussion. This is, you can bring all the tools in the world, but if you don't actually change the culture or the organization itself, then all the tools in the world aren't going to do you any good. So seeing that pattern play itself out on the mainframe side is actually was actually very very pleasantly surprising to me.
Excellent. Mark, same question for you. What are some of the unexpected things that you learned from the findings of this survey?
Yeah, a couple things, Eric. One was that I've been following this for a long time, and it was very encouraging to see the maturity of organizations, and that it isn't a should we, it is yes, we are. So that was good to see the progress. But also going back to what Tony said is the cultural change. There's a recognition of that, where early on it was all tools. Oh, I'll just get some tools and I'll just say I am. It's that acknowledgement that you really have to do a culture change first and get that in place and then adopt the tools.
Okay, so we're talking a lot about cultural change. Brent, how does a DevOps or development team leader catalyze change in their organization in order for DevOps to really take hold?
You know, I think part of it is recognizing the role the developers play in that environment and really kind of changing the way you think of your applications in the mainframe. I think there's a tendency to think that the applications on mainframe are just there to be maintained, and really kind of changing that mindset to looking at this as a place of innovation ends up being really important. And that means changing your relationship with your developers. You know, these are, instead of people that are just kind of doing maintenance changes on the environment or kind of taking tickets and adjusting code, these are people you're going to look to change the way your business runs and really respond to your customers. And I think that's a new mindset for the mainframe environment. It's something that you see in the distributed environment, and you see people kind of, well, how do we address this differently, and how do we use like technology in order to kind of really hit customers where they are? That sort of mindset has to translate over to the mainframe environment as well.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
changing the viability of the platform and the fact that the platform is a modern, dynamic platform that you can make work for you is one of the bigger mindset and culture changes that you need to see here.
Right, and I think there's been a gap that is now closing up, where there was so much progress in automating processes on the distributed side with all the pipelines, the DevOps automation, agile practices, and the mainframe was stagnant. Now that's changed, and now the mainframe is catching up. And so the picture of what a mainframe developer experience is now changed. So it isn't just staring at a green screen like it's 1980. That has evolved at most sites, and so that it is coming. So that gap is closing, but we still have some more of that gap to close.
Yeah, and if I
So
can
Mark,
expand on,
go ahead.
well, if I can expand on the comment that Mark just made, like changing this idea of what a mainframe developer is actually ends up being really important with regards to, you know, staffing issues and kind of longevity of the platform from a resource perspective. You know, one example of this is I had a client in the UK, a bank, that was going through some skills shortages on the mainframe, and they wanted to bring developers out of their distributed environment and have them start doing work on IBM Z. And this was, you know, right before they started their mainframe modernization journey. And what they found was that their distributed developers didn't want to touch COBOL. They didn't want to touch mainframe application programming because they didn't want it on their resume. They didn't want to feel like this was the end of their career. And so they kind of, you know, went and scratched their heads a little bit. And this is one of the things that kind of drove them towards the adoption of open API layers and modern IDE practices, because then they had developers that were willing to kind of move into that environment because they were using languages and programming practices they already knew, and they didn't feel like they were going to be stuck in the stigma of being a mainframe programmer.
So Mark, you have a long history in the mainframe space. What's the difference in the mainframe developer experience compared to that of developers in distributed environments?
Interesting question. There shouldn't be. It should be that they could use similar tools, similar processes. Granted, it's going to be different languages like COBOL and I have JCL. There'll be some platform differences. It should be the same, but I think many are still stuck with, as I said before, 1980, the mainframe developer works on a green screen, does things manually. When we make the changes to adopt more modern practices, it then solves a lot of problems, like what Brent mentioned of, you know, having distributed people come to the mainframe because there isn't that learning curve. And it also, for the existing developers, frees them up from a lot of things that they just assume that's just life on the mainframe. You know, I do manual testing. I work on one panel at a time in ISPF. That's just the way it is. They're not aware that a lot of these things can be taken away, and it will free them up for the interesting parts of the job, which is the creativity and the coding, and getting rid of a lot of error-prone manual practices.
I think too, if you go back 10-ish years, the difference between the developer experience on the mainframe and that on the distributed side is night and day. I think today it's not any different unless that developer or that the engineer chooses to keep the same classic mainframe interface. I mean, if you want to use ISPF and that's where you're comfortable, that's where you're going to stay. But you have the choice today of modern Eclipse-based IDEs, a lot of VS Code extensions. You have all kinds of capabilities that are available to you that make your developer experience no different than a guy pushing Kotlin or React onto a cloud. It's the same thing. And I think that's, you know, Mark talked about closing the gap earlier. That's that gap, and that's how it's closing. They're starting to bridge that difference between the two to where now the platform that you're pushing to and the language you're using is really more of an implementation detail than it is a technical requirement, right? You have all of the same capabilities that you do in one platform or the other. Now it's just a matter of understanding the business logic you're trying to push.
So Brent, when it comes to DevOps, why is the developer experience so important?
So the developer experience is really important for a number of reasons. I think the one that probably hits home for a lot of people is just the retention of talent. You want to make sure that your good developers are not like fielding calls from recruiters and thinking about leaving your organization. So you want to make sure that these people are happy and that they want to be doing work for your organization. But it also increases productivity. I mean, like, you know, a happy worker is a productive worker. We have a lot of employee experience research at Forrester that talk about how if people are kind of in the zone and they are happy with their environment, they're able to be more productive. And doing things like, you know, abstracting away some of the frustrating parts of doing your job, like manual testing or you know, kind of like focusing on connecting with green screens, like just being able to kind of engage with the code ends up being an important part of improving that developer experience. And as you can see, like from the research, it was actually one of the drivers for a lot of mainframe modernization. And mainframe modernization is not cheap. Like when people are doing these sorts of major changes to their environment, they're investing millions of dollars, and they're investing that money in order to make sure their developers are happy and productive, and that happiness and productivity really hits the bottom line eventually.
Okay, so Brent, for a long time, as you know, developing in the mainframe has been siloed, using different languages, processes, and development environments that are, you know, different than other platforms. But lately, there's been a lot of talk in the industry about adopting modern techniques in the use for the mainframe that are being used on other platforms like DevOps and Agile. How does this change what's expected of a mainframe developer?
Right. I think it means that mainframe developers are going to have to like dust off their skills and kind of engage with their colleagues on the distributed side to learn some of the newer methodologies that are out there. I think some things are just going to be like, wow, that's great. I can get like, you know, code coloring, you know, with my code so that it's easier to identify mistakes. But they're also going to have to start thinking about like, okay, I have a monolithic application. How do I break that up into smaller applications that have function calls? How do I think outside of a batch processing mindset into kind of an event-driven or microservices architecture? And it means that there's some learning that's going to have to happen for veteran mainframe developers. But I think like this is the place where managers and the people at the director level really have to do the investment into organizational structure and change and create a really positive environment where learning is rewarded. On the other side of the house, though, I mean, like those mainframe developers that have been doing code on the mainframe for years have done some really interesting things. And I think one piece there is you have to highlight some of those interesting things for the distributed side as well. You have to show that this is a platform where really smart people have been working for a long time, and make sure that you break down that stigma of mainframe development as being kind of an old arcane science. Because people were doing in-memory swaps on COBOL a lot decades ago, right? Like so there's some really interesting ways of dealing with complex problems that happened within the mainframe. Taking that knowledge and that expertise and converting it to kind of a modern development architecture really just kind of unlocks value for the whole organization.
Yeah, I think gone are the days where the mainframe guys can go, oh, it's different here. This platform is different. Things don't work that way. This is not the way you do things. I think that the proliferation of DevOps on the mainframe platform and a lot of the modernization stuff that's going on today is showing that really this isn't that much different. This is just another platform. The concepts are the same. So I think one of the big changes that Brent highlighted is, or expectations, excuse me, of the mainframe developer is now you're going to need to start integrating your code and your best practices with the rest of the organization. This can't just be a black box anymore that someone throws a request on a message queue and then black magic happens and response comes back. Those days are gone. API layers, all of the modern technology that you've seen in the distributed platforms is coming to the mainframe. So the mainframe, to Brent's point, the mainframe developer is going to have to jump in and embrace those technologies. And to the point he made at the end, a lot of those things come from the mainframe. The whole idea of cloud computing and the concepts that underlie cloud computing were in the mainframe in the 90s. And that's where a lot of the cloud architects and distributed side got their capabilities. And I think the mainframe needs to dust itself off and reassert itself as a platform of innovation and a platform of communication and cooperation with the rest of the business, with the rest of the organization.
Right, Tony, and I totally agree with that a lot of these practices may have originated on the mainframe, but then they weren't all carried out.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, we agree that we should do automated testing, but do you do it? No. There was no way to automate it, or they would tip crude automation. The technology came up, and again, that gap where it wasn't applied to the mainframe. So now what we're doing is, I think, a two-way street in interchange and really breaking down those silos so that the mainframers can learn from the distributed teams about their pipelines and their automation and agile practices. The mainframers can share the power of the mainframe and unlock it. And going back to what you said, Brent, is opening up those applications and breaking them into smaller pieces so they can be consumed. It's really exciting because it's like a force multiplier where you're going to get a lot more from your organization by having much better cooperation and really exploit the things in the mainframe. So using the distributed practices to open up the mainframe and then really start to exploit the power of the mainframe in ways they haven't done before.
Yeah, I was at a conference earlier this year on a panel, and a couple of the guys in the audience asked, well, how come there's not the same frameworks for automated testing? How come there's not the same technologies on the mainframe as there are on the distributed side? And my answer was, well, why haven't you created them? Right? Why? I mean, the testing frameworks like Selenium and Cucumber, those were all open source projects that were created by developers on the distributed side in order to solve a problem they had. Whether it's at a company, they created this and then they open sourced it, or they just created an open source. That's what the guys on the distributed side have been doing. And my question back to them was, why haven't developers on the mainframe side taken that same approach?
Well, Tony, this study and some other studies that we did this year showed that organizations actually want to begin to prioritize using the same tools across distributed and mainframe development. What do you think are the benefits of using the same development tools across platforms, and how does the adoption of consistent tooling across platforms help alleviate some of the problems that we see?
I mean, it's consistency, right? You already know the tools that you've been using for DevOps. You know what they're capable of, you know what they can do, and you've spent a lot of sweat equity building in the external pieces or third-party pieces of that for the different platforms. You have your security scanning built into those. You have your static code analysis built into those. You have a lot of your testing frameworks built into those. Using those same development tools on the mainframe platform and on the cloud platform, and in some cases with mobile, those are consistently proven capabilities that you know how they operate. So they give an organization a sense of reuse for all that sweat equity that they've already put into that. Straddling both mainframe and cloud, or mainframe and web, or mainframe and mobile. Now the interfaces are the same. It's the same group of people looking at basically the same things. COBOL is just a language. COBOL is just the patterns and the parts of it shouldn't matter, whether you're doing COBOL or Kotlin or Java or whatever. So now if I'm using the same tooling and those same DevOps platforms across the same DevOps capabilities across both those platforms, then that actually now allows you to put those cross-functional teams together. And
right, the mainframe isn't strange anymore, and COBOL's just another language and not that difficult to learn. So
that's
you're
a much better way of putting what I was saying.
Right. Well, because I go back to the working like 1980. If you say, "Oh, you want to work on the mainframe? Okay, take your time machine. Here it is. You might as well have the 3270, right? This is the way we work there." You're adding a lot of burdens to it, which are unnecessary. So if you work in the same type of environment and use some of the same tools, yes, you happen to be working on a COBOL application that's running on the mainframe, but that's not really important. And those are easy things to learn as long as you're working in a familiar environment using similar tools.
Brent, what are some of your thoughts along these lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think another piece of it is that we're just looking at a more hybrid cloud integrated world. You're going to have applications that span mainframe and cloud. You're going to have applications that are being accessed by customers directly on the mainframe. And you want the code that you're creating to be as infrastructure agnostic as possible. And I think you get there by kind of sharing your practices between the distributed and mainframe environment. You're using the same repositories, you're using the same coding environments, and you have kind of the same ethos and culture in order to make sure that your technology stack really achieves your business goals in a uniform way, and you're not kind of doing it in a siloed manner. Outside of just the programming practices, there's been a lot of development in the last year or two on how do you unlock applications and data in the mainframe to be consumed in cloud environments. I mean, I was just listening to someone today that was, looking at using object storage in order for data storage, but they still wanted the applications to run on the mainframe. I was looking at, API storage layers that allow you to do, instead of doing an ETL pull from the mainframe for a batch of data, you can actually directly access vSAM files that are on the mainframe from cloud-based applications. in order to get to that level of complexity and integration between your cloud and your mainframe environments, you're going to have consistency with regards to your development practices and the tools you're using.
So it's been suggested that organizations enable mainframe developers to work the way that they want and with the familiar tools at their fingertips. So, Mark, how do these modern tools and processes help new developers become productive contributors more quickly?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying before of eliminating some of the barriers. So you don't have to say to work on the mainframe, you now have to go and use these totally different practices. So if I'm using the same IDE, same tools, I just happen to look at this application that is in COBOL, there's fewer barriers. And one of my colleagues wrote an article on how to trick people into working on the mainframe, and that's part of it. It's it's how to trick them. You have that interface and go, here, point at this code, and the code comes up. It looks a little funny, but they can work on it because it's only just different syntax. So it's really trying to get as much commonality as possible. Obviously, things are going to be a little different in the mainframe, but to eliminate as much of that as possible.
Yeah, I mean, as crazy as it is, if you're used to using a Git platform, if you're used to, a modern IDE, which is what engineering schools are teaching today, then the underlying platform is just an implementation detail. And I mean, that's ultimately the thing. I call it tricking them into working on a mainframe, which I love. I absolutely love the idea of that. Or just giving them that capability that they know. Then it doesn't matter. The reason you can go into a car today, doesn't matter what make or model, and just drive, is because all the pieces are the same. The gear shift might be a knob, or it might be a stick, or it might be something, but the concepts are the same. And it's that kind of consistency with the development tools on the mainframe, which is allowing now a guy who just got out of engineering school to be able to go into this platform and say, oh, I can do this work. I know how to do a clone, and I know how to do a pull request, and I know how to check my code back in. And now the developer is just concentrating on writing great code. Doesn't matter what the platform that you're pushing to is.
Okay, so we've talked about how these processes and tools can help attract new talent, and also how it can increase productivity. What we shouldn't overlook is how they're affecting the veteran mainframe developers. So, Brent, how do you think this new approach is making positive changes for veteran developers?
I think there's a number of things. I think giving people the choice of, whether they open up a green screen versus a modern IDE makes a lot of sense. I mean, from back in the days when I was a Linux administrator, I was a VI person, and there's the VI and Emacs wars, right? I was much more productive in VI than I was in Emacs. And so, the same sort of thing. There's certain things where it's just easier to open up what you've always used in order to get the job done quickly. But then you may be able to be collaborating with someone else on the distributed team where you do have to kind of open up the modern IDE and dig into the code that way. So I think allowing the flexibility is one piece of it. But I think another one is just elevating the status of those developers, really recognizing the great work that they've been doing over the years and lifting that stigma of their work being kind of hidden in a closet, not really recognized, not really seen. I mean, we're kind of in this world right now where, being an application developer is like having a superpower. And we should be able to recognize that the veterans in the mainframe space also had a superpower. They were essentially keeping all of your bank accounts safe and running properly for decades. These are the people that were making sure that the insurance calculations actually worked correctly. These were the people that made sure that you got your tax return every year. These are the people that made sure that your your hospital records were safe and up to date. Like there's a huge amount of value there, and I think that you have to recognize a lot of the innovation and successes that happened in that environment and recognize that expertise. So I think that's one big thing, is kind of bringing the kudos and the good developer experience, not just to the people that are just getting out of college or working for some startup SaaS company, but also recognizing the real work that a lot of people put in as veterans in the mainframe space.
I love the idea of elevating, right? That these guys, girls, people are not just maintainers. These are engineers, these are developers, these are people that are putting out solutions that are every bit as sophisticated as anything coming out of Google or Netflix or any of your top software engineering. And the other thing is too, in this day and age, like you're saying, there's a new stigma, for lack of a better term, on being an engineer, being a developer. Now we're the cool ones, and that wasn't always the case. And if we're the cool ones, then the Mount Rushmore of people that brought us to this point are the guys that are sitting on the mainframe right now, to Brent's point. And so I love the idea of elevating that and making this, because this changes for everyone. These changes are not just for a kid coming out of college. This is for all of the guys, and recognizing that they have new capabilities and new tools and new ways of doing things. That should be exciting.
So Mark, when we talk about giving mainframe developers these new superpowers, what are some of the new initiatives that you're working on at BMC to enable developers to work with the tools of their choice?
Right. Right. When you talk about tools of choice, we've had for decades ISPF, the green screen, of course, and then we moved very early on into Eclipse with our Topaz interface. We're now moving into VS Code as well, so that we'll offer all three of those interfaces. And we have some web interfaces, but for IDEs, you now have a choice of the traditional ISPF, which is going away but still around, Eclipse, and now moving into VS Code, so that you have that choice of whatever one you're comfortable with, but then you'll have the same tools to work with behind that. And also there's a whole world of webhooks and APIs that we have, which are not an interface, but one thing I've often say is sometimes the best interface is no interface. By having things being automated, you don't have to manually do them. So we've been working a lot on all those things to make automation possible, so you don't need an interface.
Yeah.
Great. I want to thank. Go ahead, Tony.
No, that's all right. I think that's absolutely key, because if you watch the sort of the progression of DevOps, when it originally started, you're seeing the mainframe go almost step for step through that original progression. And I think now, to Mark's point, your ability to automate all those processes that before were manual, that you wanted to make sure there was someone to kick that part of it off to make sure everything was good. We're getting to that point where DevOps has proved itself on the platform, and now you have the ability to do that automation, to have those interfaces, or lack of an interface, the anti-interface, if you will. I think having those capabilities on the platform are going to be really cool, and I think it's going to really sort of kick DevOps into the next phase of automation across the platform.
I want to thank everybody on this panel for all of your contributions to this discussion. Brent, we look forward to working with you in the future on some of your research surrounding mainframe DevOps, and also with modernizing the developer experience. Some great insights out of this study. And again, everyone who registered for this event will be receiving a full copy of the report, Developing Your Modern Mainframe Strategy, Build a New Culture and Toolchain Together for DevOps Success. Again, thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.